Deleted session, January 5, 1979. Good evening. Now, the overly conscientious self is opinionated, close-minded, pedantic. It believes it is right. It is possible to be opinionated at times, closed-minded, and pedantic in good normal behavior. But when certain characteristics group together, then you have the formation of an overly conscientious self, which acts in a repetitive manner, always showing these fairly rigid characteristics. In your culture, this portion of the self is formed in childhood and early school years, often as a result of the conflict between the need for obedient behavior toward adults and the need for independent growth and activity that might well be judged by as rebellious by the elders. When I said it was not rational, Rob noted in the 367th session, they said, I spoke relatively speaking. Of course, communication is possible. The conscientious self groups about ideas of right and wrong. This portion of the self is often altered, its characteristics becoming less apparent as individuals move through the various social groupings of work, church, or community, where it is obvious that the standards of behavior are hardly rigid, but adaptable. You two have largely worked alone, and your work goals involve, of course, the development of personality characteristics that must apply to artistic work. You are aware of the fact that a great painting can still be great despite depicting, say, acts of violence that are bad. In a certain fashion, you begin to apply the wrong kind of moral judgments. I will try to explain, though you may, Joseph, at first disagree. The material that came from unknown today, you disagreed with the type of lettering, if I understand properly. Now, that is legitimate as an artistic judgment, but it is illegitimate as a moral judgment. There is nothing wrong or inferior about the people apprentice who made the improper artistic decision. It is not immoral or wrong not to have excellent artistic judgment. The people involved are in an art department. They are individuals doing their best to develop their abilities and their lives. But your indignation was moral in narrow terms, rather than in quite acceptable artistic ones. You do this often. Rupert does it when he reads poor material. He immediately makes a moral judgment against a point whose material is artistically poor. The person involved may indeed have difficulty artistically in expression, and an artistic revulsion can then be quite acceptable, but not a moral one. Now you have ever made, both of you, now the same kind of moral, or I should say immoral, judgments about Rupert's condition, which with your joint perfectionism is doubly appalling. You see it as morally wrong, not simply a physically poor condition, but a morally reprehensible one, reflecting upon Rupert's integrity, his knowledge, his understanding. You judge the world, but in far more rigorous terms morally than either of you really realize. Your bliss exists in the present. I will always go into back material, or the past when you request it, for it is important that you understand I am never evasive in that regard. But the overly conscientious selves are not separate versions of you, really. The division is one I use to make certain points. Those ideas are quite conscious when you allow them to surface. Again, they are beliefs that you least examine. The overly conscientious self is not creative, particularly, meaning innovative, but it does have great sustaining qualities and power. Dialogues with yourself may bring those beliefs more into the light, but I have often mentioned them in many sessions and in different ways. Now, you panic yourself. What body would not be panicked by some of your worries and thoughts? Again, I have covered this. If optimism seems to be such a simple-minded, idiotic attribute, then listen. It is indeed foolish enough to take it for granted, at least part way, that everything, all that is, the important things, will somehow work out all right. The foolish body, not realizing that such a philosophy is a food for idiots, replenishes itself for good activities, and in an animal fashion anticipates comfort and exuberance. Such an optimist will of course not be blind, and he will see that there are indeed many blemishes in the world, but his overall faith not only sustains him, but because of his own state of mind, his creativity blossoms to whatever degree he has it, and he manages to wipe away a few of those blights. The pessimist insists that nothing will work out right in the everyday world, and that is where you live. Illness will increase, poverty is certain, depressions and old age with the world of imagined terrors. Of course, his body does not realize that the pessimist's views are the most intelligent, proper, sane, and reasonable, and so it falls ill because the mind tells the body it has nothing to look forward to. Now let us take a peek at something else. I have told you time and time again that, but for a few exceptions, you have not used your creative abilities to help solve your problems. I suggested some changes. I will see how many you make. You suggested going to Sarah. Ruber first of all thought of how he could get his socks and shoes on. But then he tried to overcome those thoughts and imagine the trip. The idea of a van to Florida led Ruber into daydreaming, though he was very frightened of the idea. But you immediately thought of the difficulties, that it would not work, and overall neither of you have applied creative, imaginative, positive thought steadily. You pick up each other's thoughts and feelings. Ruber has made progress, but both of you still believe that worrying will somehow lead to positive action, that fear will be an impetus. I know the extent of your creative abilities. There were occasions in the past when these were applied, and Ruber improved considerably. His improvements of late have been largely the result of work in Framework 1. They have been steady since he began working, but slow. Imagining a trip to Florida, for example, or any place he wants, planning for it is a far more effective method of therapy than any worry, for such plans activate body and mind. The resolutions I gave you would automatically seep through to the overly conscientious selves if you kept them in mind, and resolved to live by them. Ruber does need some kind of class or such activity, but he has grown frightened. You have not encouraged him. He can see people more when he is better, but you must indeed act at least mentally as if you have the resources. Ruber is determined to get better. You are both saddled with old habits of thought that you really do not examine. And that is why the overly conscientious self still rules the roost. Creative change, some playful indulgence, the use of the creative abilities, and some simple reasoning with yourselves will be of great benefit. Worrying is the opposite of mental healing and will get you nowhere. Try to take this to heart. And again, in a larger framework, you are to concentrate upon the creative suggestions I have given you, and not upon the difficulties. End of session for now. Ralph said, "Okay, thank you." They said, "A fond good evening."